Good morning, everyone. As you find your way back to your seats, I'd like to ask you to think about for a moment the last time you were in a conversation one-on-one with someone whose name you were supposed to remember, but you couldn't. Really, think about the last time. If Alex said a few minutes ago, that's what Janice said this morning. Yeah, that's probably true. Church is where that happens a lot, right? When I was a RA at ACU, my first year as an RA, my sophomore year of college, there were 56 guys on each hall in the freshman dorm. And one of the challenges they gave us was to learn each guy's name 2 weeks in. And out of all 56, it's hard to match a name with a face for that many people. You know, you're getting to know everyone. And I remember one day I got called out. Probably the 56th guy who I was walking through the hall and I saw him and I, did that thing you do sometimes, like, hey man, or hey buddy, whatever it might be. And he stopped, he said, Zach? And I said, yeah. He said, do you know my name? And so I thought for an awkward 5 seconds. And I looked at him and I said, Ryan. He said, that's right. Ryan later became a youth minister here at this church. But I was glad. I was 50-50 that day on how confident I was. Also, think about a time you were in a conversation with someone and it became clear to you that they didn't remember your name. How many of you have seen the movie Castaway? By show of hands. Not as many as I would have thought. So Castaway, you can see here, it stars Tom Hanks. He is a process engineer for FedEx, working internationally for FedEx. He travels around the U.S. and the world, this character of his, trying to help FedEx smooth out their different processes and everything. And so he's going, in one scene toward the beginning of the movie, he goes to Russia. He's at a family gathering for the holidays. His pager goes off. He has to travel to somewhere else right away. And so he goes and gets on a plane. And as he's boarding the plane, he says to one of the pilots, he says, hey, Alan, how you doing? And then if you are familiar with the movie, if you even haven't seen it at all, you probably remember the premise. The plane goes down somewhere over the South Pacific Ocean. And while in the crash scene, what you see is that Tom Hanks' character is aided by this pilot. This pilot actually gets out of his own seat to make sure Tom Hanks' character is buckled up and brings him his flotation device, brings him his survival kit, everything he needs. Well, then Tom Hanks sees that his little locket with the photo of his girlfriend is on the floor. He unbuckles himself to get out and go get that, taking his stuff with him. And then the pilot, who he called Alan, sees what has happened, and he gets out of his own seat again, unbuckles himself, and is trying to get Tom Hanks situated again, get his own stuff. And that's when they make impact with the ocean. And so Tom Hanks' character is the only survivor in this situation. He's in his flotation device, turns into a raft, an inflatable raft, and he gets on it, and he wakes up, even though he was knocked out at some point, he wakes up on the shore of a uninhabited island. And so then you can see here, he's 12 days on the island. He's counting it that way so early on. Probably hoping he's going to be rescued any day now. It ends up being over 4 or 5 years that he stays on the island. But around this time, around 12 days, he sees the body of one of the pilots washed up on shore when he climbs to the top of the mountain on the island, and he's able to see it. He rushes down there, and of course the man has passed away, and he's going to bury him. He makes a memorial site for him, and he is looking through his wallet, and that's when, looking at his ID, Tom Hanks sighs to himself and almost rolls his eyes at himself and says, Alfred, not Alan. And sometimes we do that, right? We have interactions with people where we don't remember their name. It's clear to us they don't remember our name. Sometimes we get called by the wrong name. Sometimes we call people by the wrong name. And the reason I bring all this up is we're starting a sermon series today called The No Names. And what we're going to do is we're going to be taking a look at interactions Jesus had with people in the Gospels in which we do not know the name of the person that Jesus interacted with. And there could be a handful of reasons why we don't know the person's name. One of those reasons is that sometimes the story is more powerful without the name. Gilbert is going to preach next week on a story that becomes, I'm almost glad we don't know the individual's name. Because Jesus, later in the story that Gilbert's going to preach on, refers to this individual as such a more powerful, familiar name than even what the person's name might have actually been. So sometimes the story is more powerful when we don't know the name. That way we can place ourselves into the story a little bit more. Maybe that's some of the intention with the biblical writers. There's the possibility of biblical writers respecting anonymity. Dan made a good point when I was chatting with him this week about this and saying that there was some risk during the time of the Gospels of being affiliated with Jesus and being a recipient of Jesus' power. In terms of the biblical writers respecting people's anonymity, I don't give this one as much weight. Take the woman caught in adultery, for example, that Olivia preached such a wonderful sermon on several weeks ago. She had so much of her life had already been exposed in that moment in a public and disgraceful way. And then Jesus, of course, says, "Go now and leave your life of sin." He says, "I don't condemn you either." And so I think in the Gospels were written so many years later, I don't give this one as much weight. The reason I think most of the time, my personal opinion, that we don't get the person's name is that the biblical writers, the writers of the gospel, never knew it or they don't remember the person's name. One of the beautiful things of Scripture is how God used several imperfect human people to bring all these writings together. And just like us, their memories got hazy sometimes. And they were writing years and years after the event. You know, a lot of times, sometimes we think about the Gospels being written in such a way where, let's say, Mark was following Jesus around with a pen and a pad, trying to catch everyone's name. Sometimes, about once a year or so, I go to Chiefs training camp and I write a practice report of everything I see. I post it on arrowheadpride.com if you ever want to go read them. And I write down everything that happens in practice, everyone who made a catch, everyone who did this. And so sometimes I have the little book right next to me that has everyone's jersey number, so I can just make a quick note of the jersey number. Then later when I'm writing the report, I look up who has the jersey number, and I want to be specific. That's not how the gospel writers were writing. A lot of these guys were writing years and years later. And also, to go to the point that they may not remember the person's name or never knew it, is that a lot of these stories were told verbally for years and years before they were ever written down in what we currently know as the Gospels. Take, for example, here's some probable dates of some New Testament writings. If you had a chronological Bible and you open it up to the New Testament, 1 Thessalonians would likely be the first book of your New Testament. And so here's Paul talking to the people in Thessalonica about you became a model for all believers. But this was years before our Gospels that we have were ever written. Philippians around 62, Paul's death around 64, 65, and a lot of people place Mark in 65. And so we see that this Jesus story was told verbally for a long time. And so these stories probably circulated for a while before they were ever written down into gospel form. Also, to the point, a lot of times when the gospel writers did remember somebody's name, they put it down. And I want to highlight a couple of those. Bartimaeus. You see that Matthew and Luke don't record his name, but Mark makes a point to. And Dan, this would go to your point that Matthew was written before Mark, right? Dan's one of the lone scholars who defends Matthew being written before Mark, but a lot of people believe that Matthew and Luke depended on Mark as a source, but it's but it's Mark that records the name, and Matthew and Luke who don't. Also, when Jesus heals Malchus's ear, the servant of the high priest is what this three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, refer to this individual as. But then John, writing years and in some cases decades later, gives us his name, Malchus. Peter takes out his sword, he strikes Malchus and cuts off his ear. And so today we're going to get into our first story of a person whose name Jesus interacted with, but for the person whose name we don't know. This is a Google Earth shot of the Sea of Galilee. One day, Jesus says to his disciples, "Let's go to the other side." And so what that would mean to the disciples is Jesus is saying, let's get in the boat, and let's go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee at its widest point is about 7.2 miles. So that is from this intersection of 119th and Flum to just about the distance from here to 119th and State Line. And so for a boat, that's a good ways to cross. And the Sea of Galilee was known for storms popping up. This is not the story we're talking about today, but it happened on the way there. So we're going to talk about it a little bit. This, of course, is the Rembrandt painting of the storm on the Sea of Galilee. You might remember we talked about this recently. It's kind of fascinating that Rembrandt painted himself into the picture, and he's looking right at us. And so he kind of tied a little bit of a self-portrait in here. Of course, Jesus is asleep. You see how a lot of different people are reacting. Some of them are frantically doing everything they can to try to control the boat. One person is vomiting off of the side of the boat. And you can see, some people are trying to wake Jesus up. And so this happens on the way to the other side, which was Jesus's idea in the first place that they go. And if I'm the disciple now, and so Jesus, he stands up and he says to the waters to be calm, and they become calm. And what do you think the disciples' reaction is? Excitement, right? No, they're scared because they're just getting to know Jesus still, and they see that he has this power over even nature. And so their response is fear, and that's going to come into play in a few minutes. Now, if I'm a disciple at this point, and the storm has finally calmed down, which I thought might drown all of us, now I'm thinking, well, at least the good part about this is, our boat is kind of beat up and everything's ruined, and we're probably at least going to turn around and go back home, right? Because if we go back to this map of the Sea of Galilee, one thing that Chris Bullard pointed out is that over here, where Jesus was on the west side, that was the predominantly Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee back in his time. And so this is where they were when Jesus said, hey, let's get in the boat and go to the other side. They have the big storm somewhere in here. And then I'm thinking at this point, because the disciples probably weren't very keen on the idea of going over here. This is the non-Jewish side. Back then, it's associated with demons, it's associated with ghosts, it's associated with darkness, all types of unclean, to a Jewish person, unclean practices. And so they're thinking, well, now we get to go home at least. But they don't, they just keep going. And so they approach the region of the Gerasenes, and what happens then is there's a man who sees Jesus approaching. Now, it's important to remember that over here on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, nobody knows Jesus yet. But there's this man who is possessed, Mark tells us, by a legion of demons. And let me tell you a little bit, it's really disturbing when you think about what Mark says about this individual. Not only was he possessed by demons, and not only could the people not subdue him, they tried to chain him hand and foot, but he would break the chains. He had superhuman strength. He would not wear clothes. he had marks of self-mutilation on his body, and he lived in the tombs with the corpses. And this man sees Jesus coming, and he runs to the shore to meet him. Remember, no one knows Jesus on this side yet. No one's heard of him. And he screams at the top of his lungs, "Jesus, what do you want with me, Son of the Most High God? Swear to God that you won't torture me." Jesus says in response to this voice, he says, "What is your name?" And the spirits controlling the man, they say, "Legion, for we are many." And again, they beg Jesus not to send him out of the region. And so the spirits speaking through the man propose an idea. They say, instead of sending us into the abyss, they don't want to go back into the sea. They say, send us into the herd of swine. And there was grazing on a nearby hillside, Mark says, there was a herd of pigs numbering around 5,000 is how Mark describes it. And Jesus allows the idea, and he sends the spirits out of the man and into the pigs. And a lot of you know the story. The pigs become possessed by the demons that were possessing the man, and they run off of the cliff into the water and are drowned. And so some of the irony in this is that they wanted to go into the pigs so they would not end up back in the water, and that's where they end up anyway. And so you can see there, I love this painting here, this portrayal, the frantic nature of what's going on here, of these pigs running off of the cliff. Later on, some people who were tending the pigs run off and tell everyone in the village what had happened. We won't get into what kind of major blow to the local economy this may have been. Anyway, people come to see what's going on. And they see this man, and Mark describes it like this, dressed and in his right mind. And what's their reaction? Fear. It's no accident that 2 times in a row, Mark has told stories that are really kind of stories that go together in a lot of ways, where Jesus does something miraculous, and the people who witness it, their reaction is fear. The disciples, because he has power over the storm, and it's easier even to see why these villagers would be afraid, because this man, not only all the things I mentioned earlier, his supernatural strength, but Matthew tells us that he had become increasingly violent. He had probably harmed other people. And we remember they couldn't subdue him. He would break the chains. He would break out of whatever they put him in. He was probably the community's number one concern in terms of public safety. All they know about Jesus at this point is that Jesus is more powerful than whatever possessed this man. And so they plead, their request of Jesus, after being overcome with fear, is they plead with Jesus to leave. Get out of here. That's their number one thing. We don't have any record of them. They don't want to talk about the pigs. They don't want to talk about how amazing this all is. They want him to leave, and they'd probably prefer that he never come back. So you see, there's this depiction of this man sitting with Jesus, dressed and in his right mind. And this man, not knowing anything about Jesus beyond what just happened and beyond however it works with knowledge he gained from the spirits that were possessing him, he has a request of Jesus. He says to Jesus, please. He pleads with him, please, let me follow you. What a beautiful request. What a brave request for someone who doesn't know Jesus beyond today. He's ready to become a disciple, ready to lay it all down. He wants to get in the boat, leave it all right there, take whoever's clothes he's wearing, and get in the boat and go. And what's Jesus' response to this beautiful, brave, courageous request? No. This man is offering, willing, pleading, begging to physically follow Jesus. Jesus' response? No. Instead, Jesus says, go back and tell your family all that the Lord has done for you. Well, this is probably discouraging to this man at first. Let's go back to this Sea of Galilee. And let's think about some of Jesus' thinking here. It may not make sense to the man right away, but over here, where Jesus is about to go to return to, people know Jesus. Bullard liked to point out that sometimes, if for those of us who are familiar with the gospel story, and totally okay if you're not, sometimes in the gospel story, there's this curious habit Jesus has after he heals someone of saying, be sure that you don't tell anyone about this. And especially in the Gospel of Mark, he says this a lot. And Bullard points out that it's almost a 100% rule that when Jesus says that, he's over here on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. And it's almost a 100% rule when Jesus tells people to go and tell what the Lord has done for them, he's over here on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. So Jesus is working out, revealing who he is on a different timeline on the west side of the Sea of Galilee than he is on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, it would seem. And so Jesus has a different idea in mind for this man who's so willing to come and follow him right now. Jesus has a different vision in mind for his life. And so what happens, Mark tells us, is quite remarkable. Remember Jesus said, go and tell your family everything that the Lord has done for you. But what happens instead is that the man not only tells his family what the Lord has done for him, but he goes into what Mark describes as the Decapolis, which in English just means 10 Greek cities. So the man takes it a step further, actually lots of steps further, and he goes from town to town, and Mark says, telling everything the Lord had done for him and about how the demons and everything and his whole story, the ugliness of the beginning of it, the beauty of his encounter with Jesus, and the people's reaction, not fear this time. They were amazed. The cool thing is, I don't know how much time passes, but if you flip forward a few chapters in Mark, Jesus is going to go to the Decapolis himself. And so here he has a forerunner, a little similar in the sense of what John the Baptist did, but on a different side of the Sea of Galilee. Here he has a forerunner going ahead of him and talking about the amazing things that Jesus has done for his life. My guess and my hope and the way I like to picture it is that a lot of the people who Jesus ended up interacting with in the Decapolis when he traveled from city to the city himself were people who had already met this man. So 1 point and 2 questions for you today as I wrap this up. First, the point. No matter how dark your life has been, Jesus wants you to share the grace you've experienced with others. And yes, maybe if some of us, if we contrast our life to the Gerasene demoniac, it's not that bad. But also, we've been in some dark places, right? We've been in some dark states of mind. We've experienced some hard things in life. We've sinned knowingly and deliberately. Even so, Jesus wants us to go and share the grace we've experienced with others. Now, a question. What may the implication be for you personally that this man didn't get to follow Jesus in the way he originally wanted to? And I'm not going to offer a lot of commentary on that. I want to leave you with that question as a point of tension, other than just to say, sometimes following Jesus ends up being a whole lot different than what we originally thought. How is that true for you?